Hello and welcome to another edition of the RotorHub International Podcast, and that's presented by me, Gideon Ewers, editor at RotorHub International. Now, today, joining me is Andy Oxenford. Now, Andy describes himself as a gash line pilot, but in fact, what I have here on my desk is a copy of the third edition of his book, Reflections of an Oil and Gas Helicopter Pilot. Now, Andy, come on. You've seen it all, haven't you? And this is the fascinating thing that I think about the book is it really is almost like a personal history of the development of offshore helicopter support.
Yes, I suppose the origins began sitting on a bank in August in year 2020 at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary with my rig of intravenous drips in the sunshine, watching the ambulances go by. Later that evening, I went back to the ward and mentioned to the man opposite me in bed that I thought I'd write a book about accidents, air accidents. And he turned over and went back to sleep again. So I didn't think that was a very good start. So I thought, well, if I was going to make it worthwhile, I'd have to build something more into it. And so I used my experience on the North Sea as a timeline. And though I tried to keep myself in the background as much as possible, because I was just one in many who made it all possible.
But that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, and the book does pick out a lot of events and accidents through the history as people, I guess, with the development of offshore helicopter support starting in, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, which is obviously, relatively speaking, when hurricanes aren't blowing, a fairly, benign environment compared with that of the North Sea. And so I guess that's another element is looking at that development and that more hostile environment. I'm trying to find a better phrase, but a more hostile environment to operate aircraft in, and understand how aircraft can be employed, and that sort of going back to that, looking at those accidents and picking out and teasing out the lessons and watching that development.
Yes, I realized that these accident reports often materialized in print a year or two after the event, by which time others had taken place. And of course, we've been put another 500,000 hours in the logbook, and they were somewhat long forgotten. And a lot of the lessons probably had been bypassed, or the recommendations at the time the CA knew they needed to do, but could get away with, because they hadn't published, or the AARB hadn't published their report. So there was always a time lag between the event and the actual implementation of anything worthwhile. I think the North Sea was one where a lot of people in the early days got into by default. There were two bunches of people. Those coming back from Vietnam looking for a job so they could do the European tour. And the second was because of the 1973 oil crisis, which put a lot of people, or denied people, work with the fixed-wing companies because they weren't hiring, as was the case with myself. So it was obviously places which were fast developing, like the North Sea, which is a natural sinkhole, as it were, for out-of-work pilots. And I was one.
Natural sinkhole. Yeah, aviation journalism is another one, I have to say. another good sinkhole for out-of-work or retired pilots. There are legions. But yeah, it is that thing of thinking about how this sort of coalition of elements came to create what is this sort of I suppose, the gold standard of toughest helicopter operating environments. And in the North Sea, where you have this thing of, as you say, those elements like the 73 oil crisis, the downturn in hiring in the fixed wing world, the large numbers of people who had significant and quite challenging helicopter experience on the job market, and all those things coming together. But it is also the thing, I guess, a little bit. Some of the companies involved at that stage were cavalier is probably not the right word, but there was more a sort of gold rushy, I guess.
Definitely. And of course, in those days, there were only two major helicopter companies in operation on the North Sea of any consequence. And there always were, I think, for a long time. And they were Bristow's and British Airways helicopters. The beginning of the end 70s and beginning of the 80s, Bond and British Caledonian dipped their toe in, but they were never major companies. And so there was, I would suppose you could say, between the two, there was a cartel and they were making a lot of money. And so the more, when you're making a lot of money, it seems to develop greed within the organization to make more money. And because you could see, in the case of Bristow's, obviously it was a private company. Where the British Airways helicopters, it worked on a budget. You have to indent for what you wanted each year, and a bit like the military. And if you didn't spend it, all of it, the budget, it went back to the parent company at Heathrow. But having said that, they were most welcome to have a helicopter company up to privatization when Lord King privatized it, when privatized British Airways. Because for the 5 golden years, I suppose, between 1977 and 1982 for British Airways, they were making surpluses which were ploughed back, I suppose, to the parent company at Heathrow, enough to employ all 56,000 members of the company worldwide. So you can understand there was a certain element of, get on, get out there and make the money and get as much ad hoc work and whatever. And so this trickled down to the pilots. And so if any legislation sort of passed their in-trays, it was often parked, as it were. I think a case was when Dave Paul ditched because Sikorsky put out a letter that all the fan belts on the coolers, in gearbox coolers, should be changed out because they'd had a rogue set go through and they'd been damaged by acid. And of course, that was interpreted by the management as, well, we only use Sikorsky ones, and this must be in a rogue patch. So, but rogue ones used by not an OEM, as it were, and so we won't bother. And of course, they snapped and they overheated and had to ditch. But there's so many stories like that. So yeah, it was worthwhile overlooking a lot of stuff.
It's kind of interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, with British Airways making that much out of their helicopter division at that time, it decided to divest the unit, really, I suppose. Or was that just because of a market hardening, later?
The market. It was definitely the market. After 1982, there was a downturn in the oil industry, and it was pilots started being laid off. Helicopter pilots started laying off. The oil price stabilized. The airlines picked up, and when it came to British Airways being privatized, we were seen to be a risky part of their sideshow, as it were, to get rid of us quickly, which was probably a good idea from a shareholder's point of view, because within 2 months of Maxwell buying the company, the Chinook with Bush Vey broke up in the sky just before landing in Sombra and killing 40, how many? 44, 44 people. Only 2 people survived push from 1 passenger. So yeah, that wouldn't have gone down well with the shareholders if they just bought in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is that changeover. I guess it's that volatility in the oil market where it exists since, I guess, the first oil was found at Spindletop. There's always been this sort of feast famine, I suppose, basis for the oil business, and where we are in the current oil business right now with barrel prices and geopolitical situations and stuff like that. It's just an example of how volatile I suppose it can be, and when your focus is, just for keeping shareholders happy and the next quarter's figures and all that kind of things, it's harder to take that longer view, I guess. But yeah, just circling back a little bit to some of those industrial issues. It's quite unusual from the pilot union aspect, or airline pilot union aspect, I mean, I can't think of any. There's only a handful outside, besides Balpa, which have helicopter pilots within an airline pilot union. Am I right in that? I'm pretty sure that's the case. I certainly can't think of that many.
I don't know of any.
Yeah.
No, it took years and years and years for Bristers to adopt the union. I remember we went on strike in April 1977. I joined Bristers originally, and we went on strike in April 1977 to try and get a union, become unionized, because we felt that British Airways had extraordinary good terms and conditions, whereas Bristol's had hardly any. If they are getting danger money, for example, for the pilots in Nigeria, it was just plowed back into the company coffers. It never trickled down to the pilots. And so, yes, I think that was when things started changing a bit. Yeah, it was an equal split. It was a strange strike because it was only centered on Aberdeen, not the whole company worldwide. And it looked like there would be 100% turnout, but like all good things, it only turned out to be 50%. But it was sufficient, and it was the first strike in aviation history for many, many years until later. Another fixed-wing airline went on strike, maybe 30 years later. So most things were fairly harmonious, but in those days, it was different.
Yeah, and it's
we were lucky to have Balpa.
Yeah, and speaking of Balpa, some of the you and I talked a little bit about some of the gymnastics that leaders within the helicopter group, like the fabulous Dave Hogg, had to perform to actually make the agreements happen, I guess.
Yes and no. Not to speak badly about Dave, but there was a period under the Maxwell tenure, I think it was 1989, when the wages were set, negotiations were set in October at 6%. This was under the Maxwell regime and stalled. And so the following spring, we decided in Sombra, where I was based at the time, that we would withdraw goodwill, which was well within the pilot's agreement. And that went on for a few weeks, and we just upped the ante each week until 22%, which coincided with, I think it was, and then they started talking again. But unfortunately, no representative of BALPA visited Sunborough to see how effective it was. And so that 22% was whittled away quite quickly in the first meeting in the meeting in Oxford, Maxwell's headquarters, for 15% for captains and 11% for co-pilots. So yeah, you could make things happen without the union being involved. In other words, sometimes they weren't the best friend. And I think when we lost the Shell contract in 1996 or thereabouts, I went to see Dave at his farm, and I said, we're losing 75% of the pilots. And he said, oh, don't worry, 2P will take care. Bristow will pick them up. And I said, no, they won't. They only want, half that number, because they've got many more people they can bring in from overseas, and that'll leave a lot of people unemployed. So at the end, I was successful in recommending the pilots' wives talk to their husbands to say, look, just hold your ground and don't make the walk across the apron to Bristow's, which they did. Only 3 people did, I think 4 people did. And that was very, very successful. And CHC stayed on the North Sea. It was a fire case trying to get, because they realized that the figures didn't add up and they would be leaving. We had this from the head office in St. John's. And the rest is history, I suppose. And we picked up all the ad hoc work because, of course, they couldn't do it because they didn't have the pilots. And we got all the contracts from the other oil companies, because Shell was always the one which wanted the most tits, as it were, in agriculture pilots. And anyone else got the hind tit, and they didn't like it, even though they were big companies like Texaco and Conoco. So that's what happened. But more interestingly, 2 of the people who walked and thought they got a better time in Bristow's realized it wasn't so rosy, and they became company council chairman. one in Norfolk and one in Aberdeen. So we put a couple of cookers in the nest just to put the icing on the cake.
The icing on the cake.
And much unionized, but basically speaking, if you wanted to get anywhere in this helicopter industry at the time, you really had to hold your own ground, otherwise you get trodden on.
Yeah. Now let's just circle back, to the kernel, the core of the book, which is looking at all those various accidents over the years and teasing out the lessons from them, and think about the evolution of safety. If, as you look back across all those decades of those oil and gas support operations and stuff, and the safety of those operations, are you happy with the way things are now? Are you happy with the progress that's been made? Or do you think there's still quite a ways to go?
I am happy. For 2 reasons. The ditching at Penzance, which is a civil operation from Penzance to the Scillies, when that went down in fog, it was a real eye-opener because it was off the North Sea and it was in the public domain, as it were, as opposed to just being not covered up by the oil industry, but kept quiet by the oil industry. It was right out there, and the enormous number of lessons learned from that, which trickled down into the oil industry and passenger transport on the North Sea. And that was superb. I think more latterly, after I'd actually finished flying, the 24-hour, I finished flying around about 2012. The CEA wrote a paper and about survival basically, and they introduced a lot of elements for the benefit of passengers of an aircraft ditched. In other words, being able to sit next to an emergency exit, not flying in winds over 60 knots, and having a reasonable chance of recovery, and the size of the individual being able to fit through the emergency exit again. Because it was demonstrated when the Chinook ditched that the military did an exercise and found that only 4 people would survive going through an emergency exit when the aircraft was designed to exit 11 if it turned over. So that left 7 who would never ever make it. But fortunately, this exercise was carried out after the Chinook left the North Sea. But yeah, these things were eye openers, which all sort of came together. And of course, by the time I finished flying, the design of helicopters was such that they could either be modified, like the 61. You could alter the windows so you could pull them out, or new helicopters are coming on the scene, and the windows were designed at the planning stage for suitable exits for everyone. And so, yes, big improvements, but none of these things, safety really didn't cross our minds, I suppose. We just got on with the job. A case in point was lightning strikes. It was years later that they realized that helicopters were causing lightning strikes, not weather. It just happened to the polarity of the cloud happened to be an opposite polarity to that seen from the helicopter. One was negative and the other was positive. And so you get a ginormous strike. Nowadays, they call it trigger lightning. And case in point, I was flying a 61 one evening, and a lightning ball came through the center window, traveled all the way down the back, which in the old days in British Airways was a little loo behind a curtain. And but on this occasion, it had been withdrawn. And there was a gentleman sitting there, and he was struck. And so we were landing on a large enough platform. Deck, it was a semi-sub 703, I think it was. So a Bell 212 could come in and take him to hospital. And we spent the night there waiting for some new blades because all the blades were shattered. So the Met Office then started identifying areas when a cold polar stream was coming in over the warm North Sea. And it was long before the cumulus clouds had developed that you entered this area where there's a temperature around about 6 degrees and below, where you would generate a trigger lightning, even though there were no clouds or storms on the radar. So yes, lots of things like that, a huge improvement.
Andy, we have been beaten by the clock. It was great fun talking to you, great fun thinking about those reflections. And if you want to know more, people out listening about the reflections of an oil and gas helicopter pilot, you can buy through all the good resellers, those beginning with A and others. The 3rd edition is available. I encourage you to get a copy. Read it, enjoy it, and inwardly digest it. But for now, Andy, thanks very much for spending the time.
Thank you, Ewan. It's nice meeting you, and I enjoyed talking to you.
That has been another edition of the RotorHub International Podcast. Join us again next time when we'll be talking everything vertical aviation.